Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Dwell's Lunch and Learn series. My name is Tripp Prince. I'm the head of formation here at Dwell, and it's great to have you with us. We create this space, we carve out this time on a regular basis here at Dwell, really with an attempt for us to explore what it looks like to live life in the digital age and how our digital lives intersect with Christian spiritual formation. We host these lunch and learn hours primarily for our staff team, and yet we love to share them with the broader Dwell community as well. And so we have guests who join us for these and really help us to think deeply, faithfully, critically about this issue of faith and technology. And today we're going to do that again. So our guest is Brandon Rickabaugh. And Brandon, let me just introduce you to the team and to anyone who may be listening. And then I will quickly hand it over to you and let you just lead us into this. Brandon is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Research Scholar of Philosophy of Technology and Culture at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Brandon's also a member of the Cultura Fellowship at the Martin Institute for Christianity and Culture at Westmont College. Brandon is a very smart man, very well educated, many advanced degrees, including a PhD from Baylor University. And his area of focus and research expertise is in the area of consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious people? Really, what does it mean to be a human being? And as Brandon and I were talking just a minute ago, I think that's a question that increasingly in this age of AI this or generative that, it's a question that is at the heart of what it means to be a follower of Jesus here in our modern age. What does it mean to be a human? How do we relate to God and one another as people, beings made in his image? And so if at first glance, some of this feels perhaps a little abstract or philosophical, I think it's anything but. It is really at the heart of what it means to follow Christ in our day and age. And so what I'll do is, Brandon, hand it off to you, let you talk for a good while here and just help us into some of these themes of your own research and what you've been learning and help us think about that. And then I'll follow up with maybe a question or two, but then we always leave time at the end for the staff team to hop on. And so staff, as you're listening, do take a note or two, listen attentively, and if a question comes up in your mind, jot it down and be ready to hop on and we can discuss that towards the end. So Brandon, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand it to you now.
Yeah, this is really wonderful to be with you, and I'm excited about this. We got thrown off twice, so it's nice that this third time's really working out. Yeah,
third time's a charm.
This is a talk that I've given, and I'll give just sort of portions of it, and see what comes out in the question and answer, maybe. But the idea is that there's this poverty of spirit in a technological abundance, and this going to move through three stages. Just what does that mean, poverty of spirit in technological abundance? And then try to say some things about what I take to be sort of the dangers or the causes of what's going on in our poverty of spirit. And then talk a little bit about what I take Jesus's philosophy of technology. You could think of it that way. So in 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize. And at the event, he gave a lecture. And it was before some of the most brilliant and influential leaders in the world. The title of the talk was The Quest for Peace and Justice. And you might wonder what it is that MLK would start off with. And with a title like The Quest for Peace and Justice, you might think he just starts out directly with peace and justice. But he anchors his lecture in a really insightful commentary on technology. So here's just the opening sentence, and I'll read through a bit more. He says, modern man has brought this whole world to an awe-inspiring threshold of the future. He has reached new and astonishing peaks of scientific success. He's produced machines that think and instruments that peer into the unfathomable reaches of interstellar space. He has built gigantic bridges that span the seas, gargantuan buildings to kiss the skies. His airplanes and spaceships have dwarfed distance, placed time in change, and carved highways through the stratosphere. This is a dazzling picture of modern man's scientific and technological progress. Yet, in spite of these spectacular strides in science and technology, and still unlimited ones to come, something basic is missing. There is a sort of poverty of spirit, which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers. So he does move on to get towards justice, and there's other sermons that he spoke on technology and its relation to moral and spiritual formation. It seemed to be something that he really had on his radar, and in many ways was ahead of his time. He had a gift for perceiving into culture. And I take it that there's a background here on MLK's philosophy of personalism. We can talk about that later maybe, but I'm going to share my take on what I think is going on here and sort of expand a bit on what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying. So what I think is going on in our use of technology, and I think many people are fairly well acquainted with the dangers, either experientially or just by knowing others or reading the research. I think that what we've got going on is what I'll call a radical depersonalization thesis or explanation. And so by that, I just mean to radically depersonalize just means to conceive of in a deep way, and then out of that conception, treat ourselves, treat each other, and treat God at the subhuman level, at the level of pushes and pulls, at the level of machines. And the second thing I think is going on in virtue of the first is what I'll call this outsourcing of our formation. And that I want to say is just, we seem to have sacrificed our humanity, our personality, what it is that makes us people, by outsourcing aspects of our life that are significantly formative. So I want to say, I'm going to focus on some of the negative. I'm going to end on a positive, but I'm not a Luddite. I think technology is wonderful. We're doing this through technology. I've got technology sort of plugged into my head here. I think there are really wonderful uses of technology, but I think we're more familiar with those than some of the dangers. And so I'm going to focus on what I take to be a particular kind of danger. And with the depersonalization and the outsourcing of our formation explanations, this I take to be a bit a more controversial take on what's going on in our culture. So many Christian thinkers have understood our culture as radically secularized and radically disenchanted. And I don't find the disenchanted explanation compelling. I don't think empirically it's verified. I think if you look at, especially in the tech industry, there's pretty radical enchantment going on there. And if you look at the history of the development of AI, for example, you see explicit statements about the enchantment of computers. So what I favor is what Bronislaw Dzerzhinsky thinks of in terms of our culture is resulting from an increasing outcome of a technological process of depersonalization. So I think that what best describes our culture right now is a kind of increasing technological depersonalization along with disillusionment, radical disillusionment about how to live. Right? Who are the sources that we could go to live? And I think what's really, really telling about the interplay between technology and our lived experience and depersonalization is what's coming on in terms of the next wave of the sort of technological economy, right? So the history of technology is very, very fascinating, but at some point you get this agricultural economy, you then get this industrial economy, and then you get this information economy, and then now we've got this attention economy. But the next phase, and this phase has already begun and is being called the intimacy economy. And so in the intimacy economy, we trade intimate information about ourselves and others for an enhanced, seemingly personal functionality with our AI applications. And so what's happening is conversational generative AI is changing our relationship with technology, and in turn changes our relationship with ourselves, with each other, and with God. And what it does is it enables what we would take to be genuine interactions, genuine conversations, genuine learning, co-creation, problem solving, and problem solving even at the very personal level. There's an interesting shift that you can look at more recently too. Before ChatGPT was released, we had chatbots, we had types of generative AI, and we had them for years, but they were never called that. They weren't called AI. It wasn't until ChatGPT came out and was released that we started calling chatbots AI. And what's interesting is framing it that way tells us a couple things. One, it tells us what we think intelligence is, which is, going to be reduced to something like the amount of information that you can process and the speed at which you process it. So that's going to tell us what we think intelligence is at the human scale and at the artificial scale. And as we're interacting with the AI applications in a more intimate way, that is informing what we take to be intimacy. And a way to think about this is the sort of trust that people are reporting having towards generative AI applications. And this happens because in the exchange of personal information, you give this to an AI. And as you give more of your personal information, the more it seems to be able to help us. And at some point, psychologically, it seems their attention is drawn away from the fact that this app that they're using is owned by a company and farming their information for other purposes, and start to interact with the AI as it becomes more personalized, more particularized, as if it's something that seemingly understands them and then they come to trust these generative AI. And so the economy of intimacy, I think, ought to rattle us, because intimacy ought not to be a technology, right? What will happen, and what is happening, and this has been happening for years, is that we're shifting towards understanding intimacy at the level of implicit and explicit needs, goals, motivations, and desires being met, and being met on our own terms. So the intimacy happens when I share information and a desire, a goal that needs to be reached, and then in virtue of that information, my goal, I'm aided with my goal, and that's going to be reached. Now what we have here is this sort of happening where people are starting to attribute to generative AI traits that were once considered to be uniquely human traits, or of persons at least. Understanding complex emotions, creating art, making decisions, reshaping our interaction with each other and the technology itself. The causal force that's going on with technology is becoming seemingly personal, but at that level, I think, is depersonalizing us even more. And for people that are already depersonalized, the illusion of AI consciousness, of AI intimacy, will be very strong. And as the strength of that illusion increases, the outcome is going to be even more depersonalization. And so in 61, Martin Luther King Jr. He gives this sermon. It's one of my favorites, called "The Man Who Was a Fool." And at some point, he makes this really insightful and bold claim. He says, "The means by which we live have outdistanced the ends for which we live. Our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided man." And you could think, well, we've got self-driving cars, but it seems like we've lost track of what a self is, or that we're growing in our ability to create minds, but it seems like we've lost sight of what it is to have a uniquely human mind. What I mean by that is the way I think we want to think about this, or what's helpful for me to think about this, is two modes of explanation. When we want to explain what's happening in any aspect of life, you can think of it in two ways. You can give a personal explanation, or you can give a mechanistic explanation. And a personal explanation is going to explain some phenomena by positing a person or an agent with basic powers, capacities to do things, and then the intentions to do those. So they act in a particular way to achieve some goal. So here's, an example. Last weekend, I took my son Sawyer, who's 7, and a rite of passage. We went to Guitar Center and got him his first guitar. And that still touches me, seeing him, walking around the house holding and sitting down and playing this guitar. Well, what explains my act of love in doing that for him? On a personal explanation, that act of love would just be explained by features of me as a person, as a whole. So you're going to reference irreducible aspects of me, my mind, my thoughts, my emotions, my features of my body that act in accord with those, my will, the various aspects of my personal history and social dimensions that have shaped me, and then ultimately my soul, which unifies all of those things. Now, and that seems rather intuitive, I think, but on a mechanistic explanation, that sits really nicely with the scientific mode of explaining things. A scientific or mechanistic explanation is going to cite some property at the subpersonal level of an object, and then some property of an object together with some natural law that describes the regularity of how that thing behaves. Right? So how would that work out here? Well, in the case of buying Sawyer, his first guitar, that act of love is going to be explained by subpersonal facts. And in one level, those subpersonal facts might be the neurological structure and activities of my brain. Ultimately, those stories are going to play out at the fundamental level that's going to be described by physics. So the mass of a quark that comprises my body, or all the quarks that comprise my body, together with some natural law, like Newton's inverse square law or something like that. Now, you just talk about it that way, and the person's lost. The person's gone now. And all modes of scientific explanation are at this subpersonal level. All methods of working on generative AI are also at the subpersonal level. And I think the more and more we pay attention to it, the way that we use it is also at a very subpersonal level, which would explain why it is that an intimacy economy could become such a strong and large economy. Because I would want to say we've lost sight of what it is to be a person. Yet there's still this great hunger for real intimacy. And the empirical research on this, I think, is just easy to see. So if you just went on to the App Store, you're going to see a huge number of wellness apps, and you're going to see a large number of therapy apps. And we're starting to see more and more of those that interlace with the spiritual life in a particular way, where the app is taking over the job that, say, a spiritual director or pastor had. Right. So we see this with therapy chatbots like Coco and OpenAI has had different applications of this. And what's really interesting is I think it was within a week after the first iteration of ChatGPT was released, Robert Morris, I think he's a co-founder of this a therapy app that was already a generative AI app that was already out. He announces on Twitter, or X now, that here's a quote, that their app Coco had provided mental health support to about 4,000 people using ChatGPT. 4,000 people, and that was just right after the release of it. The number of people that are using these now has grown very, very significantly. And we've had at least 2 cases of suicide that I'm aware of based on individuals forming what they take to be intimate relationships with these therapy apps. And you could imagine this at scale with other apps like Wobot or Vivabot or Wysa. These mental health apps, you could take the data and just train them on, say, the corpus of the spiritual formation literature and all the scriptures and their various translations, And then you have these apps that will be able to measure all your vitals and your all of your health. And it manages, or it pulls in all the information from, how you've been feeling over the years, tracking all of that. And now it's going to know exactly when it is you're more likely than not to act out in some sinful way to protect your heart, right? In some way to make yourself feel safe. That's very dangerous. It's more dangerous when it appears to be the case that these chatbots understand you better than any other person you've met. And that seems to be a large research project, actually. So this is a quote from Wesley Wildman and Kate Stockley in their book, Spirit Tech. They say, whether we welcome it or fear it, the era in which we can use technology to induce, intensify, and even control spiritual experiences has arrived. Already, we routinely rely on technology to manage our health, sleep, moods, relationships, calendars, travel, and finances. So it's really no surprise that we're turning to high-tech aids for the spiritual journey. As these innovations are rapidly proliferating and becoming ever more sophisticated, we're on the brink of the next and potentially most transformative revolution in the practice of religion, an era in which technological advances merge with spiritual seeking. And there's nothing wrong at all with using technology to enhance the spiritual life. That happened, right around the Reformation with the advent of the printing press. You get printed Bibles at Mass. There's nothing wrong with that. But what seems to be dangerous in these research studies is that individuals will report having a deeper, more intimate religious experience than they've ever had before. And they'll report it as being more morally transformative than they've ever had before. And what that tells me is that the standard is really low for what counts as interpersonal connectivity. And you can see the poverty of that just in how we experience ourselves and each other, and just explaining certain large-scale phenomenon in society. So the worry here is that you're going to have this buy-in of technology where we will, because we're depersonalized, but still desperate for intimacy, desperate for being known, when we turn inside, right? If we turn inside and don't see anything else but ourselves, we're in a dangerous and dark situation. If you turn inside and you see along with yourself the Holy Spirit, now this is a different sort of activity, but so many people are turning in on themselves and not finding anything but their own brokenness. And so they want to move out of that. But the move towards chatbots that deal with therapy and that are starting to deal with spiritual practices, and where they would take the place of your pastor or spiritual director, are capitalizing on the depersonalization, the emptiness of relationships, and is just going to exacerbate that and make it even worse. So here's another quote from same sermon, I think, of Dr. King that I really love. He says, "We foolishly minimize the internal of our lives and maximize the external. We've absorbed life into livelihood. We will not find peace in our generation until we learn anew that a man's life consists not in the abundance of things which he possesses, but in those inner treasures of the Spirit, which no thief approaches, neither moth corrupts." But we've got, a large group of people, including within the church, that are at a loss for what a spirit is, or at a loss for understanding what the soul is, and even radical skepticism about there even being a soul, right? But what King is echoing, I think, is just the insight and wisdom of Jesus about the importance of the interiority of a whole person's life, that they understanding themselves as a whole person, as a bodily soul, and that the Spirit works within us in a particular way that is at an irreducibly personal level that can't be mechanized, that you couldn't outsource to a generative AI. So what I think are disordered, when it is disordered, trust in technology does, which I take to be an instance of the external on the way that MLK is thinking about, that's a result in a lack of knowledge and a lack of trust in the internal dimensions of what makes us human people. And in particular, a lack of knowledge and a lack of trust. And by knowledge, I mean really interactive experience. The kind of trust that comes from really testing something well in experience. But we have a lack of trust for God. Love is going to be very hard to experience at this level of pushes and pulls. And so at the disappearance of the person, you also get this end up the disappearance of the trust in love, which is exemplified in persons. And then ultimately this distrust in God, right? And I think if you look at it at Jesus at a level where we think of it as pushes and pulls, right? And we don't think of it as knowledge, but something that is mysterious in the way that I don't know how to act on it, right? It's mysterious in that it seems something that just happens to you in order to have this sort of deep relationship with God, that his ministry doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think actually you can look at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount and see it fitting into this discussion here, because I think what's going on, at least in part in the Sermon on the Mount, is that Jesus is pushing back against the ideas that have taken action against people to keep them excluded for God's kingdom based on mechanistic aspects of those people and their lives, right? For Jesus, he thinks we've got to go internal. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit because of what the healthy tree is. And a unhealthy or a diseased tree can't bear good fruit because of what it is in its nature, in its wholeness on the inside. What happens is Jesus pushes back, I think, against people that have been pressed against the margins because of external factors, right? Because you are poor, you're excluded, right? Because you are unclean, ritualistically unclean for this reason, you're excluded. These are all ways of externalizing the spiritual life and reducing them to some sort of subpersonal level. And Jesus understands, I think, that if that's the route that you're going to go, then spiritual life is just going to go wrong. Or you could think that spiritual life going wrong ends up resulting in this desire and activity to manipulate and control the way that other people see us, including ourselves and God, by external means, by external measures. And so I think that you can track down this depersonalization explanation of culture and its on scale explosion with the use of technology just back to the fall. Really, I think you get this depersonalization showing up there. So now you might think like, well, I've told this really dark story that's not altogether happy or hope building, but I'm actually very, very optimistic for this for one reason in particular, and that's what I had mentioned before, that I think there's this really strong juxtaposition that's happening where as we become more and more depersonalized and more mechanized and more commodified, we become disillusioned with any sort of place that can help us understand how to live well. But there's this ache inside about learning how to live well, and and living well in terms of love and joy and peace, slowness to anger. I mean, we're talking about the fruit of the Spirit. I think there is a hunger there. And if you turn inside and you don't see any of that there, then we become desperate. And I don't know a better way to talk about that desperation as, the way that Dallas Willard would put it is that God lives, if you want to know where God's address is, he lives at the end of your rope. And so I think in many ways, the radical depersonalization that's escalating can be a really strong way for Christians that are really invested in their own spiritual life and understand how to bring people into the spiritual life in the way of Christ, will have a very natural way of showing people what can be fulfilled in what they're trying to find fulfillment in these kinds of technological devices. Finish here with this quote from King's sermon, a different sermon. He says, "Without this spiritual and moral reawakening, we shall destroy ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments. Our generation cannot escape the question of our Lord. What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world of externals, airplanes, electric lights, automobiles, and color television, and lose the internal, that is, his own soul?" So I think it's a good place to start, and hopefully we've got some good ideas there to think about and challenge together.
Yeah, there's so much there. Thank you, Brandon. I've been taking notes, and I am tempted to ask you a whole host of questions, but I'll try and limit myself to just a few before handing it over to the rest of the team. Here's a big one, almost perhaps unfair with how large it is. But as I hear you talking about the sense of radical depersonalization, and what that creates is a one-dimensional experience of the world as well. I think that was maybe King's phrase, this like one-dimensional encounter of reality as we are less and less the people we're made to be. I guess my question is this: could you speak to what is a distinctly Christian understanding of personhood? Because everything you just said, you could offer a solution that says, well, you should eat good meals with friends, and you should go look at a real sunset, not one that's on a reel on your phone. Do all these things that are a step towards personhood. And I think you and I would affirm both of those. And yet sunsets and slow cooked meals are not distinctly Christian, or at least are not the foundation upon which a Christian view of the person is built. Maybe they flow from it. But yeah, speak to that a little if you don't mind. What when we say we need to recover this sense of personhood, specifically as Christians?
That's really good, and yes, a big question, and could go in so many different ways. One way to think about it is just in terms of spiritual formation, and in Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, he's talking about how it is that the Holy Spirit transforms us. And he talks about it in terms of growing in virtue, but he makes this distinction between two kinds of virtue. And one of those kinds of virtue is what he calls infused virtues. And that's what he says the Holy Spirit puts in us without our effort, so to speak. But there's other virtues that you can grow in just by, doing what a good person does and growing in your capacity to do that. So you might think, well, what's the difference there? Or can't someone become a good person, or can't someone become more of a person with non-Christian means? And there I want to think, well, what would it mean for a means to be non-Christian? In the sense that the Spirit's operative through any means that is good, true, beautiful, right? So I don't think, going to see a sunset, I think is Christian in the sense that it is the Lord speaking to us through creation. Now, where it gets explicitly Christian, you might say, or where it gets down to, does the way of Jesus have anything to offer there? Then I think things get really fun. So one way to think about that is in conversation with what we've got going on now. So you've got two really different opposed views of what a person is. One very, very mechanistic. A human person is reducible to their body, or reducible to their brain, or reducible to their social relations. That's a very, very thin view of a person. And it turns out that it runs us into many of the problems that we're trying to get at. And academically, one of them just is, this problem of consciousness. How is it that you get personhood built up out of non-personal things? That's a really big problem. Now, on a more Christian view, you've got human persons are irreducible wholes. That on some views they're identical to souls, immaterial souls, or on a view that I find attractive, you could think of it as a bodily soul. Now there you've got like a very, very integrated whole. The person's not reduced to any of the things that I mentioned. Now what we want, so one is just that vision. That vision of a human person is fairly unique to Jesus's insight there. In fact, just the insight that he has that you're not reducible to your behavior was, thousands of years ahead of modern psychology, which after it went through its stint with idealism was just steeped in behaviorism. But Jesus already had insight into that. So one way is just to test the theory of human persons. What is a human person? But then to test it in life, right? To test it in life. And it turns out that trying to push people in a certain direction is not going to be at all helpful, both for us and for them, right? Depending on the way that the Spirit works in the world, in terms of who God is, how it is that we grow in love and trust, what love actually is. Now we're getting down to particular details about what it is that Jesus knew and taught and explains, how he lived. So I think we take Jesus serious as a person. That's unique. Often we can read the scriptures and just think about Jesus as a historical figure and not as a real person, a full person. So we can read the scriptures that way and understand, well, what did Jesus know? What did Jesus believe? What were his feelings like, his emotions like? And then I try to participate in what the Holy Spirit's doing to become more and more like Jesus. That's very, very different than any other view that I can think of, certainly in philosophy, about what a person really is and how it is that a person changes. Because it's not just about imitating someone else. It's not just anyone. It's Jesus, who has a very, very unique vision about what life is in God's kingdom and how it is that we become the kinds of persons that can live there. So I think we get down to those details and work it out. I don't know, is that helpful, or am I sort of getting at what you're after?
Yeah, I think it's massively helpful. Thank you. And I appreciate the way you landed there, just that sense of what is distinct about the way that Jesus invites us to walk. Because it is something you walk out and journey with him, not just the abstraction of knowledge, which is maybe a related question, because I think you've spoken to this fear, the sense that fear of replacement, perhaps. We look at LLMs, we look at ChatGPT, and I'm like, it can do things I cannot do. And industries, light up and they say, oh, this is going to take this or that job and, shake everything up. Because we've all, as you say, we kind of get reduced to, well, I guess I'm nothing more than how quickly I can process data or how quickly I can regurgitate information. And as you were saying that, I think I was just mindful of the way in which at least the stream of Christianity I was formed in, whether really consciously or not, there was this emphasis on almost that as a vision of the Christian faith itself, which is this sense of, actually, as a Christian, your primary aim is to acquire information, to know data about the Christian faith, know more verses than anyone else, have it all more history than anyone else, have it all in your head so you can spit it back out. And this kind of knowledge that's abstracted from how we live. Of course, it wouldn't have been consciously taught that way, but I think there is a real current of faith that perhaps is can fall prey to that. And fall prey to this sense of faithfulness is principally about what I know. And I don't know if that's a question. There may be a question in there, but just, is that particularly something we should be mindful of when we're in an age where there's always going to be this threat of more information? Like you and I cannot keep up in any area. And maybe that's
right. So, a couple things that are really fascinating about that. The information question is really interesting. So if you ask most people what they think the internet is, at some point they're going to say something like, well, it makes all the information available to you. And that's exactly the opposite of what it is. It actually is an information limiting tool, right? You search for something and the algorithms work to give you an answer. Based on all these other factors, it will limit down what's going to show up first at the top of the list. So one thing is to realize technology always limits and tells us what it is that should be sought after as knowledge, right? Because it puts it within a particular perspective of, this is the right goal to work on to get at, right? So again, technology is really, really great in so many ways, but no one thought that building the interstate was going to end up becoming a detriment, a horrible factor for the disintegration of the family. No one thought that. Or the radical injustice that happens in virtue of how you create cities that keep buses out of certain ranges because the bridges are too low, right? And now there are resources that individuals that ride buses can't get, right? So the technology tells you what problems to work on, then that tells you what kind of knowledge is valuable, and now you've really limited it, a vision of life there. And we're living in the aftermath of that. So should we look at it as just information gathering? That I don't think is going to be helpful at all. But I don't think actually information gathering is knowledge either, though. So I want to say the answer can't be ignorance, right? The solution can't be becoming naive. The answer, I think, is to just recapture a vision of knowledge that Jesus was after. He talks about salvation eternal life is knowledge of God. He debates people. I mean, one of the first acts of his ministry that's recorded is him as a little boy debating the scholars of his day. In Matthew 22, he goes, very serious debates, to the point at which that chapter ends with, and no one dared ask him a question again. But the point, though, was he was interacting with reality as it is and inviting people to come in and test the information based on that. And that's where you actually come to know it. And it becomes like real life. So I guess, is that helpful? I try to touch on everything there.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful. I have another question. As I ask it, if anyone on the call wants to jump in as well, I mean, I could sit here and talk with Brandon all day. This is super fun, but I want to share the room as well. So if you have a question, if something is burning in your heart and you'd like to ask it or kind of bring it into the broader conversation we're having, go ahead and put that in here, and I'll loop you in here in just a second.
Can I say one more thing? Sorry, I forgot. There was one more thing I forgot.
Okay, go ahead.
St. John of the Cross saw this issue about information and what you were talking about in terms of the church, like prizing that, right? So he talks about this final stage of purgation as this dark night of the soul where God purges from us these inordinate affections towards things that will include the religious life. So an inordinate affection towards running to the scriptures to make me feel better, to worship something other than God. And that, I think, is fascinating, because one point I want to try to make as best as I can, as often as I talk about this, is that we're not talking about a new problem. This issue of controlling and manipulating things to get them to be the way that they want them to be is a sin problem. It's a lack of trust of God and love. And so I like pointing out that so many people before us got this. There's actually this the really fascinating line in the Pensée by Blaise Pascal, where he says, people only go on vacations to be able to tell everyone they went on one. That's like Instagram. Like, he already knew, like that was a problem back then. And his insight into helping that, I think, is wonderful.
He was curating his public image long before. It was cool. Amazing. That's super insightful. So I was going to ask, it's hard to talk about this field without thinking of things like iRobot, Will Smith's film, because I think there's this fear of the machines will get so smart that they'll turn on us. I remember reading an article, it's probably a year or two old by now, but I'm sure you saw this as well. One of the engineers at Google working on their LLM talked about he was convinced that their system was sentient. And I think he got fired as a result, kind of like, you're crazy, get out of here. And yet there are these moments where you kind of see this or that advancement and you think, maybe that guy wasn't crazy. Maybe there's something here. And yet the thought is, when someone hears that, is either iRobot, oh, they're sentient and they're coming for us, or someone hears the machine is sentient and thinks the machine is human, because we almost hear sentience and think this is human. And you use consciousness a lot. And so I guess I'm curious, is there a distinction, and how would you differ between something being sentient and being conscious?
So even before that, I want to distinguish that question from the issue that's usually that you brought up before. There's a difference between being able, knowing what it means for something to be conscious, and our ability then to attribute to something that it is. So these issues about, these go back to sort of what's called the imitation game or the Turing test. Can you get a computer to trick people into thinking that it's a person? You can do that and the thing not be a person, right? So there is this automata. The history of automata is super fascinating. But there is this chess-playing automata made out of, and it started beating people at chess. And people just started to think it was enchanted. It turned out there was someone inside, moving it around and playing, a good chess player. So they fooled everybody. And one thing to learn from that is, just because we're fooled does not mean that we're seeing things, accurately. Just because we can think that a large language model appears to be conscious, we've got to slow down there, right? And think about what sort of inference are we making, and is it reasonable, and should we start acting in virtue of that? The question between sentience and consciousness is really, really important, I think. So by consciousness, neuroscientists and consciousness researchers, philosophers are interested in one main aspect of consciousness called phenomenal consciousness, or qualia. And that's just the raw, what it's like to experience something. So what it's like to see red, or what it's like to see a sunset. Different than the information that you could get. So a famous thought experiment is, you've got this person, Mary, who's neuroscientist, knows everything there is about perceiving color, but she's never seen color before. So she knows all the data, but she's never seen it. And she walks out and sees color for the first time. Did she come to know anything? And it seems like she did. She came to know what it's like to see color. And that knowing what it's like to see color, that experience of that, is what we're after in terms of phenomenal consciousness, the experience of the world. So that, I think, is a big part of what we're trying to get at with consciousness. Sentience, if you think about it in terms of the ability to arrive at a conclusion that is statistically more likely to be true than false, if you want to say that's what thinking is, then you've got to start thinking that thermometers are sentient, because a thermometer reacts to its environment with the right kind of information that more often than not is accurate in terms of that. That's a really low bar, right, for sentience. And so I would want to say, so there's a book that I co-wrote with J.P. Moreland, and there's a chapter in it it's on this, called The Unity of Consciousness. And it's issue about how it is that we have all of the experiences that we've got, and all the sense modalities, color, smell, taste, all of those sorts of things that are had by one person, one subject. That is such a difficult problem for any view that thinks you're made of parts, computers, or anything like that. Because what you could just ask is, where in the computer is there a thing to be conscious? You've got what's called an aggregate of these separable parts. So if you want to look at, or you could even go just to the program. So if you want to look at a neural network, what part of the neural network is the thing that's conscious? Because there's no one part of the neural network that's processing all the information. So that's a whole issue to go into, but I think that's one really good reason to think that you couldn't have, in principle, an AI that's conscious. But I think you also couldn't have one that's sentient either, because there is always this phenomenal, what it's like to experience states of knowing, or states of reasoning, or states of thinking. So I think they can't be pulled apart, actually. Got to go through some stuff to get there, but I just think they're unified. They're not there. So LLMs are, not doing what we're doing.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. Okay, we've got a question that came in. The camera is not working, so they texted it to me. But this one's a little more personal, maybe a little more vulnerable, if you're up for that. The question is this: in light of everything we've said, how do you and your family use technology well? Followed by, do you use ChatGPT? And if so, how?
So one way I use ChatGPT is to study how it is that people will be fooled into thinking that it can be a good spiritual director. So I'll ask ChatGPT, tell me what St. John of the Cross would say to someone who's struggling with anger towards the church. And then it'll spit it out. And, I've kept, examples of that through the different iterations of ChatGPT. So one way I use it is to just let me see how it is that I could get a degree of sophistication that if someone had mechanized the spiritual life, that would be more than enough for them. So one way I'm using it is to just try to figure out how can it go wrong for us. Right? So you read these things, early on, ChatGPT is not supposed to help us create bombs. Then people figure out how to do that by asking it how not to create one. So I'm sort of asking it how, you know.
We're asking it
Right,
hypothetically,
right, right.
right?
I don't want to
Hypothetically,
make one, so tell me how to
what would
not
you?
do this. So I'm using it in
Yeah,
that way.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but I will use it sometimes to, just to be totally transparent, help me understand different turns of phrases in writing, because I kind of get dissatisfied sometimes with my limited, you know, knowledge about different ways stylistically of writing things. Most of the time, and I'm just plugging in like 2 or 3 sentences. Most of the time, I won't get anything that was super helpful. But sometimes, I will. But in the negative, it's just helping me see, okay, I'm not missing out something horrible, and then I need to go read some Walt Whitman or something like that to like really get it. But you can ask it that too. You can put
Now,
something in. I've done this before. I've done like write a 500 word lectio reflection in the style of Dallas Willard. Right? That's not satisfying. Right? Like, I don't think yeah. So Willard, new book came out, right? The Scandal of the Kingdom. And I helped a little bit with that. And what was, I didn't look for a large language model to help me. What I loved doing was going through Dallas's stuff, because it was Dallas's stuff. So ChatGPT, I would not want to use it for anything that would try to supplement uh, anything deeply personal. I don't want it to write something for me in the style of Dallas. I want to know what he wrote and where God was at with him there. So there's a really wonderful study on curiosity in Thomas Aquinas, where he talks about how it can become a vice. And one of the ways that he talks about it is that when our thirst for knowledge gets in the way of our vocation, where we're just trying to learn more than what we need for our work. And I think our use of technology is one way to do that. So one way I do really love using technology with my family, I've loved doing stop motion with my son. Lego stop motion. I was so surprised at the apps that are like so sophisticated in editing. So we've made like our own Star Wars. I mean, it's been really incredible. It's been really wonderful.
so you'll just take
Yeah,
photos and then it
it's an
strings
app
them
that'll do
together.
that for you. And then he
Okay,
figured in how to do
okay,
like
fine.
Foley artists, add in sounds. And it's been so much fun. It's been something that we
Yeah,
use to
that's
gather around and be creative with each other. But what I don't want to do is go look onto YouTube and find out how everyone else has done it, really. Because I just want to have the experience of exploring it with him. And my goal, and I'm trying to teach him this, our goal shouldn't be to try to replicate what some brilliant cinematographer did. Right? Our goal right now is to just let's play with this and work through the frustration or whatever it is. Like, this is different. So technology can be used. One way to think about technology is as an extension of our natural capacities. And so a hammer is a super obvious one. What's not so dangerous about it, or less dangerous, is that it only works when I'm holding it. And I understand exactly how it works. And so the more an automated thing, the more it will run without me being there. And the less I understand about it, the more dangerous it becomes. And so that's one way that I try to think about the sorts of technology that I'll, want in the house. We don't use an Alexa or any, I don't use Siri or anything like that. I don't do much reading at all. I like to hold books. Now there's economic, issues there where I will read things on a tablet, but I try to have things around that, that can, I don't want to say, that can decompose, that don't give me the illusion of lasting forever. Is one way, I'd think about it. So, Sawyer's, and Willow's wanting to learn how to cook. Well, we could look some stuff up, and I'll look up a recipe, but let's just get messy. So I try not to use technology that's going to influence us in doing something exactly how some other person did it in terms of their personality. I mean, I hope that's.
it seemed Yeah, I love that. And the thing I love about what you just said is the way in which these technological devices or tools are really aids to your own creativity, aids to your
Yeah.
own exploration. Even making a stop motion film, that's a creative act. That's a communal act as well.
Yes.
You're doing it with someone, in this case, your son. But it seems that with efficiencies, with automation, what is so often lost is that our own
Yes.
participatory role in the creative act, in the creative process. We sit back and passively receive. We watch a fractional minority do something while the rest of us, the masses, just
Yes.
consume it, which is a risk we run. But tools, they can also be helpful tools to encourage creativity if we have eyes, and really a discipline to see it, to say, I'm not just going to watch you do it. I'm going to go
Right.
do
Right.
something
So
else.
just being
Yeah.
more vulnerable, um, my wife and I have learned that when things get heated, right? I mean, we just know from the neuroscience, you need like 20 minutes for everything to rush out of your frontal cortex so you can calm down. But we found that if we go out, when we separate in different rooms and text each other, the affective tone of frustration or hurt or fear or anger lessens, and we can just sort of hear the content of what each other's saying without the assumption of her being really disappointed with me. Now we got to reconnect, we got to get out, but I was surprised by that. Before that, I never would have said my cell phone's really going to help me when, distancing myself from my wife's going to help us come together. I wouldn't have expected that, but it has.
Yeah. 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 That's interesting. Yeah. I see that. I can see that for sure. Okay. I want to respect your time, and we're
Oh,
creeping
I'm
up on an
loving this.
hour
I'll
here.
keep going.
Let me okay, okay. Let me ask you maybe like one final question, maybe specific
Mm,
to the work we do here at Dwell. And so I think I'm mindful of this beautiful picture you've painted of the recovery of personhood, to say we shouldn't accept one-dimensional views of the world. We should be mindful of the fact that we are people made for communion, made in the image of a triune, communal, loving creator. And so because of that, as his image bearers, we are made for God. We come from God and are made for God and have the ability to commune with him. And yet something like Dwell or other digital Christian resources, they introduce into that process a very one-dimensional tool. So how do you welcome in a tool that has this limitation, yet see it as almost a window,
mm.
maybe iconic in some way, a window through which you can pass beyond that one dimension into something that is true, something that is eternal and good? Maybe in a simpler way, when you look at something like Dwell, the work we do, what gives you cause for optimism? What gives you cause for pause
Um,
as a Christian?
Talking with John is one. Talking with him a little bit about how he sees these things, right?
Yeah,
Go to the person. I think what you said about
yeah,
icons is
right.
really good because when the Protestant fear is that you're worshiping the icon, and that's not what they're for. They're they're helpful tools in drawing our attention onto God. And just think of the name Dwell, right? Like you've already told people what to expect in some way, right? It's not a performance app or something. So I think a big part of it is how do we tell people what to expect out of this? What are we trying to tell them this thing ought to be used for? And if you own its limitations, I think that's really, really good. But if you magnify the ways that it can be really wonderful, I think then you end up having something like Dwell has done, which I love, is let's get people whose voices are so different that they show up as people and not, some robot, right? Um, People that are different than me, people that make me wonder, like, what are you doing when you sit down with your Bible? Like, who are you with? What is your church like? Things that are sort of drawing me into the person. Trevor Hudson's, Lectio they're so lovely because he shows up and you give him space to pause, you know, and you're not trying to overproduce something. I think, I'm guessing, I don't know how, it is, but
Yeah. No, that's
so
absolutely
part of that
the
is
aim and
just
intent.
let's let the technology serve the purpose there, right? So think of when the Bible was first printed. Might not, maybe like I love studying, of course, but I don't want to read a Bible that's got study notes in it. For some reason, it's too distracting for me. So I want the word to just be what it is there and I don't want my Bible to present something more than that to me. Right? So does the app do that? Again, attention, where is it drawing my attention to? Expectation, what is it setting me up to expect? And what are the possibilities for using it? I get really worried that if we build in community kinds of apps or community features into apps, because we will mistake it for community, and that's just, you're setting people up for a low view of it. And the other thing with attention is that what you put your attention onto something, and we're limited in that, so it draws our attention away from something else. So I talked with John, and then we mentioned here too, not having an app that doesn't require you to hold on to it to use it, or that's about the feeling of it, right? Part of what's so dangerous about smartphones is that the level of power you have in proportion to this, just this tiny little thumb movement is huge. I can totally harm someone on the other side of the world with this little movement, right? And that you don't sort of engage that by having the app focused on something that you do to manipulate that piece of technology. You're sort of, here's a way to hear God's word, and that's all it is. So those are my thoughts.
Well, you're articulating values that really drive a lot of what we do at Dwell, a lot of the work we do. There's several developers and designers on the call, and I don't want to in any way minimize the beautiful work they do, but like you just said, the primary aim is that you listen to Scripture. It's not about looking at the Dwell app. You want it to be intuitive and easy to use and beautiful, but what can it or how can it open the world to you as you look up and look around and hear from God, literally hear from the Lord through his word? And I think there is something intentional about that for us, and limiting to say this is not going to be all things to all people. We're not going to have a full immersive video experience. It's like, no, this is a way for you to hear from God and still stay connected to his world. We've created some fun content like playlists for nature walks, that sort of thing. Like what can you do if your eyes are up and out and not just down?
I've thought before, like, what if you had some
that's been a
feature
value of
where,
ours.
I can't remember what it's called now, but I leave some sort of prayer note somewhere, like at a park or something, and people can go and find that and get it or something. What's that?
Oh, like
yes,
like
yeah.
geocaching.
It's silly, I don't know, but
Yeah,
I think it would be fun.
that's fun. I like that. I'm going to file that one away, and if it happens, we'll give you credit. How about that? Awesome. Well, that's hard to top. That's maybe a good place to stop. Thank you all for joining us today, Brandon. Thank you for your time. Like I said, I could keep talking for a while. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and the care and the faithfulness you bring to these really significant topics. I can tell you do so as a devout follower of the Lord, and it encourages me greatly to hear you talk. So thank you.
Bless you.
All right. God bless you.